Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program that we ran on. So the midterm elections are coming up. They're already here. Within 6 weeks, the primaries are going to start. So it's an opportunity for us to raise our demands, preferably with green candidates, but at least by making our demands on the candidates who are running in various public formats. Petitioning to put the Greens on the ballot is underway in most states now. So there's no excuse for not getting involved. And there's so many life or death issues that we need to raise, from the ICE atrocities, the housing crisis, and the healthcare cost crisis, to U.S. imperialist bullying in Venezuela, Palestine, Iran, Greenland, and Ukraine, where Trump is aligned with Putin against Ukrainian self-determination. So plenty of issues to raise. And one of them I want to start with is resistance to the ICE Gestapo, or if you prefer, the state-sponsored Ku Klux Klan. They're running around like the Klan with masks on, without name identification, snatching black and brown people off the streets and beating them or killing them in some cases, and people that protest are getting beaten and abused, and in the case of Rachel Good, killed. Now, one thing to keep an eye on is that a one-day general strike has been called for Minneapolis next Friday, January 23rd. It has the support of the Minneapolis AFL-CIO and many other unions that are affiliated with it or not affiliated with it, and many community organizations. Now, none of these unions have voted to strike. They're just saying, take the day off if you can. But this will be the first general strike in Minneapolis since the 1934 general strike led by the Teamsters over union recognition. And that strike was something else. It went on for 3 months, and there was a lot of violence. What was called the Citizens Alliance, representing the bosses and the cops, killed some strikers, and the strikers fought back. So this won't be as unruly and violent as 1934, but it is significant. That strike in 1934, which was simultaneous with other general strikes in Toledo and San Francisco, Oakland, that led to the CIO organizing drive and the National Labor Relations Act a couple years later that legalized unions federally. So that was very significant. So this one on Friday probably won't be as significant, but mass mobilizations can take on a life of their own. But anyway, we should be keeping our eye on that and participating if you're in the Minneapolis area. And I happen to know a communication workers local president who I think I will ask to be on a podcast next week to talk about what's going on in Minneapolis. And he's also been active in Ukraine solidarity and in touch with the anarchist movement there. So I think after this podcast, I'm going to write him a note and see if he wants to come on next week and we can get a firsthand report. So let's move on to Venezuela, which, as I've argued, has been regime capture, not regime change. The U.S. is taking the existing power structure and cutting a deal with it. Now, there was a bill that I mentioned in the last podcast that would have invoked the War Powers Resolution to prohibit Trump from any more military action against Ukraine. And I was optimistic it would pass. The public is opposed to military action in Venezuela. And they got it through the procedural vote last week. But this week, under pressure from Trump, these gutless Republicans, Josh Hawley of Missouri and Todd Young of Indiana, flipped. They flip-flopped and voted against the bill. So it was a 50-50 tie, and Vice President J.D. Vance had to come in and break the tie and defeat the measure. So Trump is free to continue hitting the boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean, and do another military strike on Venezuela if Dulce Rodriguez, the new president of Venezuela, isn't as cooperative as he wants her to be. But I don't think another strike is likely at this point because Trump seems to have this deal with Dulce Rodriguez to sell Venezuelan oil to U.S. refineries and from there to the global market. Venezuela gets foreign exchange to pay its debts and import food and goods, and U.S. companies get Venezuelan oil business. The CIA director, John Ratcliffe, and importantly not Marco Rubio, who wants to really have regime change, met with Dulce Rodriguez yesterday to cement these commercial ties. And on the same day, or the day before, Maria Corina Machado, the woman who sponsored the candidate Edmundo Gonzalez, who won the 2024 presidential election, went to Trump's office in the White House and groveled and gave him her Nobel Peace Prize. And she got zilch. And Trump gave her a Trump-branded shopping bag with Trump-branded trinkets and told her, patted her on the back or on the head and told her to, leave. So it's clear Trump wants to do business with Venezuela, not promote democracy. And as I said, the kidnapping of Maduro is about regime capture, not regime change. Not that Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez, who is probably not as right-wing as Machado. He was actually Hugo Chavez's ambassador to Venezuela in the early 2000s. But it's not that Maduro is a solution. What they really need is fair elections where the left parties that have been banned from the ballot get to, participate along with the other parties. We're going to put in the chat a link to I think a very insightful article by Greg Palast. He's a journalist we've had on this podcast to talk about voting rights in the U.S., but he's also done a lot of reporting in Venezuela, particularly when Hugo Chavez was the president, about Venezuela, the attempted coup that the U.S. backed against Chavez in 2002, and the oil industry. He's, been an energy journalist as well. He went down there as a BBC journalist, and he interviewed Dulce Rodriguez. And his basic thesis in this article is that Rodriguez is very smart and will be able to cut a deal with Trump. She's probably smarter than Trump for sure, and be able to head off Rubio, who wants to install the right-winger Maria Corina Machado. And if Rubio gets his way and the U.S. tries to do that, it's going to start a civil war in Venezuela. As Palast notes, everybody's armed in Venezuela, and not everybody's going to accept, installing Machado as president. So meanwhile, the business goes on. This week, the U.S. has already sold $500 million worth of oil and parked those revenues in an offshore account in Qatar. And this account insulates the funds from Venezuela's creditors. So Venezuela is probably all right with it. And it helps Venezuela, which was running out of storage space. It had 50 million barrels of oil stored, which is basically at their storage capacity because of the U.S. oil sanctions on Venezuela. Now, Venezuela is getting 300 of these $500 million. And that's going to help Venezuela be able to restore state social services and import needed goods. And the U.S., by allowing the transfer of U.S. dollars to a Venezuelan bank, is de facto recognizing this Venezuelan government, which it hadn't done before since the 2024 presidential election. Now, the U.S. is apparently keeping the other $200 million. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But these oil sales, according to economists on Wall Street, is expected to generate a growth rate of 10 to 12% in Venezuela in 2026. Now, they're starting from a very low level. Their economy's been devastated, but that's still going to help Rodriguez stabilize her rule. But as I said, this deal raises a lot of questions. Is it legal for the president to create an offshore account and control how its funds are used? And is the $200 billion that are in that account after the sale, is that just a slush fund for Trump? Senator Elizabeth Warren and some other Democrats have been raising the questionable legality of this Qatari account. But, you know, it's interesting. Is Trump providing debt relief for Venezuela at the expense of creditors, which include ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil, who have won court cases to get compensated by Venezuela, haven't been paid yet. But Trump told them it was their own fault. So it's interesting. And, you know, the big creditors of Venezuela include the Chinese, who are very big, the Russians, who do have some credits, and then Western lenders and creditors. So that's interesting. So a lot of questions remain about this Trump-Rodriguez deal, and particularly, you know, how the sales revenues are going to be handled. So anyway, look at that Palast article. I think it's, you know, well-informed based on his reporting, and I think it's probably right. Now, Palast doesn't get into how Venezuela might hold new and fair elections to transition to democracy, but it's clear that Trump doesn't care about that. And of course, Rodriguez was part of the stolen presidential election in 2024. Left-wing and progressive parties in Venezuela, from the Greens to the Communists, are calling for a democratic transition based on following existing laws in the Constitution. Venezuela's electoral system is as democratic as it gets anywhere in the world. The problem in 2024 is that the Maduro government didn't follow their own laws, which required them to publish the tallies from the voting machines, which left a paper trail of ballots, which are counted by hand as well. That's how they got the tallies. So you can compare the hand-counted tallies to the machine tallies. And the opposition acquired, as they were entitled to by law, about 80% of the tallies from the machines. And they showed Maduro lost decisively by about 70% to 30%. And because those tallies have never been produced by the Venezuelan government, progressive governments in Latin America, like Petro of Colombia, Lula of Brazil, and Boric maybe pronounced, of Chile, did not recognize Maduro as legitimately elected. And neither did the Carter Center, which monitored these elections, or the UN Human Rights Commission, which also monitored these elections. The question now for Venezuelan progressives and small d Democrats is whether they'll be able to get fair elections under this Trump-Rodriguez deal. I mean, it's easy to see Trump saying, no elections, let's just keep this deal going. And of course, it could get worse. If Rubio's faction within the administration prevails and the U.S. tries to install Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez, that's going to result in a civil war because people are not going to accept that, a lot of people. And there's also reporting that's based on anonymous sources that Diosdado Cabello, who's the justice minister, and he's overseen the repression under Maduro, is interested in seizing power. So there may be that wrinkle in how things develop. But check out the Greg Palast article. I think you'll find it informative. So let's move to Palestine, where Israel continues to bomb Gaza and ethnically cleanse the West Bank with no consequences. It's rationing food, water, shelter, and medicine at deadly low levels. And the U.S. just affirmed that, at least the House did, this week by passing a State Department funding bill on Thursday that provided an additional $3.3 billion for Israel. And the vote was overwhelming, 341 to 79, which means it wasn't just Republicans that voted for this. The bill blocks U.S. funding for international bodies investigating Israel's war crimes in Gaza, including the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and the UN Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory. And that's consistent with Trump the week before last, withdrawing funds by executive order from 66 international agencies. And the legislation also blocks funding again for the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or UNRWA, which has been the UN agency responsible for providing aid in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Syria, and elsewhere. So this US-backed genocide continues with no accountability for war crimes and no aid for the war's victims. So if you want to do something about this week, talk to your representative. I sent a note to mine, a Democrat, John Mannion, who voted for this damn funding bill for Israel and no funding bill for investigation of war crimes or aid to the Palestinians. It's disgusting. And so if you don't already know, look it up, find out how your representative voted, and let them know what you think. This is just, the genocide goes on and the U.S. is totally complicit, and it's a travesty. And okay, Iran, a lot has been going on there. This murderous theocratic regime, or what the left in Iran calls clerical fascism, has massacred many thousands of protesters who were demanding bread and freedom. We don't know how many were killed because the internet was cut off and it's very hard to get information, but it seems to be definitely in the thousands. The question is how many thousands? And what's this, I think particularly disgusting for those of us on the left is that the authoritarian campist groups that, self-identify as left are bootlickers for this murderous regime. They claim that the protest movement is a product of U.S. and Israeli intelligence operatives, not the product of real, legitimate, popular economic and political grievances. And I've seen this reactionary crap from people like Max Blumenthal on Gray Zone, Jamal Baraka on Iran State Media, Press TV, and Joe Lombardo, the head honcho of the misnamed United Anti-War Coalition, on social media. I mean, these people are siding with the cops against the people, something they would never do in the U.S. But they're like Trump and his minions who say the anti-ICE protesters are paid insurrectionists. And they have the same reactionary campist geopolitical analysis, not a progressive class analysis. They're for any regime, no matter how fascistic, if it's in conflict with the U.S. That is campism, not leftism, not solidarity with working class people. And the fact is, they don't really believe working class people can make change. So they back one block of reactionary capitalist states against the U.S.-led bloc because they consider U.S. imperialism enemy number one, which is becoming harder to say right now with Trump running the scheme and align with Putin. It's kind of a new alignment of reactionary capitalist states against, Ukraine and the Russians. Medvedev, the former president, who's kind of their, the guy, their attack dog, was saying on social media this week, okay, let Trump take Greenland and we can take Ukraine. And, that is resonant. I think I mentioned this last week. I think I provided some links to articles about how Fiona Hill, who was one of the National Security Council advisors in the Trump administration, said that Putin was proposing that we'll let you have Venezuela if you let us have Ukraine. So, how do you be anti-imperialist when all sides of these capitalist countries are imperialist? It's not a left position. And they are giving the left a bad name because ordinary people, they want nothing to do with murderous authoritarian regimes. And if they think that's what the left stands for, they're going to want to have nothing to do with the left. In Iran, the left has been viciously suppressed since the 1980s when they were hung by the thousands. The left made a serious mistake. They allied with Ayatollah Khomeini to get the Shah out. And when the Ayatollah consolidated power, he just killed all the leftists, imprisoned them, and hung them. And so the Iranian left is not in a position at this point to be an alternative power that could constitute a new revolutionary democratic government. But it does seem that it has embedded itself in the labor movement, which is building a potentially transformational movement from below. The oil workers are demanding a reversal of privatization, wages that match inflation, and the release of the detained workers who were protesting. The Tehran bus system workers are demanding the right to independent unions and opposing theocratic rule, and are acting in solidarity with the students who have come out en masse against the regime. The Iranian teachers' unions are demanding a reallocation of military and security budgets to public education and demanding freedom for jailed teachers who've been swept up in the protests. The sugarcane workers are demanding worker control over production and the return of privatized units to the public sector under worker control. These are, leftist demands. So the left is obviously playing a significant role in the Iranian labor movement. And then in Arak, A-R-A-K, the central province of Iran, south of Tehran, workers' councils that they're organized in the factories issued a statement on January 11th with a slogan that sounds like the 1917 Russian Revolution: all power to the councils. Councils, Soviets were councils, workers' councils. So, yeah, we got a link to that statement that'll go up in the chat. And so there's the potential, and I don't know what stage of development it's at, of a popular democratic revolution that builds an alternative power structure, a dual power against the state that networks workers' councils and neighborhood committees. And that seems to be what the Iranian left is calling for. Now, there is the European Solidarity Without Borders, is an organization based in Europe, which has a fund to support labor movements in Asia. And we'll put the link to their call for support. If you go to the page, you'll see that it doesn't mention Iran because the page was posted in November. But if you put in your donation that the money is for Iran, it will get to their contacts in Iran. And so that's, material support that you can provide right now. But all of us as left internationalists should at least express our solidarity with the protesters demanding food, bread, and freedom or democracy, and condemn the deadly repression of this reactionary theocratic regime. These people that are saying this is all, started by the CIA and Israeli intelligence are just, like I said, they're bootlickers for the theocrats. It's disgusting. And of course, in the US, we should demand no military intervention against Iran. That will only make things worse. And of course, the regime will use it to justify their repression because the imperialists are coming. So anybody protesting the regime, we can lock them up and hang them if we will. Iran was scheduled to hang 800 people this week, and apparently called that off and told Trump, don't bomb us, we won't hang these people. And so that's where we stand. And, military strikes by the U.S., if they target the oil fields and the factories to punish Iran, that will also punish these workers' movements that I just described. So U.S. bombing is counterproductive. It's only going to enforce authoritarian rule in Iran. Let the Iranians, take care of their oppressive regime. Trump, of all people, is not going to help them. Um, so, and then we got Greenland, which, I mean, it's amazing that we even have to talk about that. But after a meeting with J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio this week, Denmark's foreign minister said, quote, "It was clear the president has this wish of conquering Greenland." So this is no joke. That's what, Trump's minions, Vance and Rubio, told Denmark's foreign minister. So Denmark has mandated that the troops it has and is sending to Greenland shoot back if the U.S. invades. France, Germany, Britain, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden are deploying small numbers of troops to Greenland. So in response, Trump today announced tariffs on those countries, starting at 10%, going up to 25% if they don't support the U.S. Acquisition of Greenland. I mean, this is madness. Of course, the people of Greenland don't want it, and if Trump, tries to do it, particularly by military means, the Atlantic Alliance is going to be without the U.S. Those countries, which does reach across the Atlantic to Canada, and through the Atlantic, through Greenland, which is a province of Denmark at this point. Basically, Europe is going to have to become its own independent power. I thought it was interesting this week that the French President Macron said the 90 billion, I don't know, there's euros, I think it's euros, which would be over $100 billion, that the European countries have pledged to support Ukraine. He said we shouldn't buy the weapons from the U.S., which is what Trump is still allowing. We should purchase it from our own armaments factories. And I think, that's a good move. The problem is Europe doesn't have the capacity to provide the weapons fast enough. So they're going to have to buy some from the U.S., as some other leaders in Europe pointed out. But that's where we're headed. The U.S. is isolating itself from the Western democratic countries, trying to ally itself with Putin. Putin is playing Trump, I think. But I mean, this is a world that, if somebody wrote it in a novel, you'd say, oh, that's too far-fetched. It's not realistic. But here we are. So I'll just stop by saying we need to also raise, as these midterms come up, the impeachment demand. Articles of impeachment have been filed by Representative Al Green, a Democrat of Texas. 140 House Democrats voted to advance that bill last month. New articles are being added as Trump commits new crimes. So this is an issue we should inject into the midterms and make your House candidates take a position. Getting him impeached will require removed will require 2/3 of the Senate. And no matter how badly the Republicans lose in 2026, it's unlikely they'll get 2/3 of the Senate held by the Democrats so he could be convicted. But who knows? I mean, Trump is getting so off the rails that some Republicans may break with him. So anyway, I think that's another issue we need to be raising. At the very least, it'll help continue the delegitimization of Trump. So I'm going to stop there and look for your questions and comments. Scout 164. To clarify what I meant last week, Secular Talk claimed Gavin Newsom ruined his chances as president because he opposed a billionaire wealth tax proposal. Yeah, I don't think that's good politics, just from the perspective purely of getting votes, because taxing the rich is very popular. All the polls show that, and it just shows what Gavin Newsom is about. He's a rich guy who doesn't want to pay taxes, and that tells you, all you need to know about the leadership of the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. Anthony Al, Green Party. I'm seeing this rift in the Green Party, with some people believing the protests in Iran are legitimate. Reality is often more nuanced. Yeah, you're exactly right, Anthony, and that's why I talked about it. the Green tradition, going back to its beginnings in Germany in the late 70s and 80s, is not to align with any military blocs or capitalist states. So people like Petra Kelly were getting arrested in East Germany as well as West Germany, protesting missiles, repression in West Germany, and anti-democratic repression in East Germany. And she is symbolic of the position that the Green Party movement took during the Cold War. And now people have lost sight of that, and they've retreated to campus positions. The campus position during the Cold War of the campus quote unquote left was to support the Soviet Union as a lesser evil. Now they're supporting countries like Iran, Maduro, who stole the election, Putin against Ukraine, because they say U.S. imperialism is the biggest danger and everything else is a quote unquote secondary contradiction. That's not a leftist position. That's a, kind of a realpolitik, position of realists who are imperialists. That's John Mearsheimer. His position is the big powers are going to control countries in their sphere of influence, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you might as well adapt and not provoke the big powers, which is a recipe for the status quo and continued oppression, and in our era, the destruction of the planet. So yeah, we gotta debate this within the Green Party and get ourselves straightened out. Scout 164. How exactly are we going to stand? ICE keeps doing what they do despite our protests, and more are becoming convinced being civil is just not cutting it. Do we either fund self-defense in preparation of people starting a revolution, or do we keep being civil as people keep getting hurt? Well, I don't think it's a dichotomy. Our public actions, our protest actions should be nonviolent, because that's, going to draw the broadest public support and discourage, police forces from being violent. It's easy if you're being, assaulted, whether it's water bottles or munitions, to shoot back. But if it's a nonviolent protest, it's harder to initiate the violence. So it's safer. It's also more effective politically with the broader public. On the other hand, people have the right to defend themselves if they're, under attack. And, but that is, that's, you really got to know what you're doing. I'm talking about armed self-defense, because, you're not going to arm, self-defense groups that are going to have more weapons than the U.S. state. So it's really about, individual cases where you have no alternative but to defend yourself. But, I wouldn't say, there are no cases where people are justified in armed self-defense, but our movement against ICE and for all the things that we want should practice nonviolence. It's just going to be politically more effective, and it's going to be safer for the protesters. Kevin Rosa. Do you think the midterms will get the Democrats to provide concessions for progressives, or do you think it will play out the same way the 2022 midterms did? Yeah, I'm not sure what you would say how the 2022 midterms played out. But, thinking back right now, the Democrats lost seats. I think they retained the majority in the House. I can't remember now. But in 2022, the Democrats were defending Biden's program, which in 2022 was after Biden had done the COVID social programs, which were popular, uh, and also, came to the aid of Ukraine, which was popular, although he sort of gave them enough to fight with one hand behind their back. So he kind of lost ground, as presidents usually do in the midterm following their election. So one thing that I don't remember the Democrats championing in 2022 was any progressive advances like universal public health care, Medicare for all, or the Green New Deal, aside from AOC and Sanders, who basically gave it lip service. I mean, talk about AOC in the Green New Deal. Pelosi would not let her bring that non-binding resolution for a watered-down Green New Deal, watered down compared to the Green Party's Green New Deal, to the floor for a vote. And AOC adapted to Pelosi more than she fought her. So that's what I think we're going to see in 2026. The Democrats at the leadership level are going to run to the center, thinking they can get people disaffected from the center who voted for Trump, and they probably will, but they're not going to mobilize the people who are intermittent voters who are going to see no reason to vote for the Democrats. That's what happened in 2024. The vote for the Democrats went down because Harris didn't run on anything progressive. She ran, she's running around the country with Liz Cheney and boasting that she had more billionaires backing her than Donald Trump. And so people that were feeling the economic distress said, there's nothing there for me. And most of them stayed home, and a good number, though, voted for Trump because he was at least acknowledging that they face problems. So, I think the Democrats will gain ground, but they don't have any solutions to our problems. And that's why, as Greens, we've either got to run our own candidates. And I say, don't run them unless they're serious candidates that can run a serious campaign. If we run a marginal campaign, then we aren't taking ourselves seriously, and neither will the public. But we can interject our issues into these campaigns by, various ways, protests, news conferences, speaking out at candidates forums, organizing our own candidates forums. There's all kinds of ways we can get our issues into the debate, even if we don't have a good candidate of our own. But we can't just, line up behind the Democrats because they're not as bad as the Republicans, or we're just going to reinforce the status quo. The Democrats are not going to provide concessions to progressives. The progressives, and this has been going on since about 1970, there have been progressive Democrats. They used to be concentrated in the Congressional Black Caucus, not so much anymore, as corporate money has bought off a lot of those districts. But, the Progressive Caucus, a little over 100 members of the House, but only about 25 of them are really consistent progressives you can count on. And they control districts that were always controlled by progressives. The district Ron Dellums was elected from in Berkeley and Oakland, or John Conyers in Detroit, now represented by Rashida Tlaib. Even the district that AOC took over, the guy who was part of the Democratic establishment, but he voted, very liberal, and, was a pretty liberal guy. These people reflect their districts. And so until we, can get the Greens organized and building a base in more districts than just the usual progressive ones, not much is going to change. And the Democrats, so you'll have some progressives out there, and, the progressive Democrats will give them a lot of publicity, but they're going to be a minority within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party as a whole is going to block what they want to do, like Medicare for all. That's why we need independent, alternative political party, like the Green Party wants to be. BD Dimmitt. The current horror over Trump's T-Rump administration makes this a prime time for reminding people of the Pied Piper memo and the role of the DNC in empowering T-Rump in the first place. The number of green issues that can be linked into the conversation after that point is made are endless. I'm not sure I'm not sure what the Pied Piper memo refers to. I know what the Pied Piper did. Yeah, it is a good time to remind people the Democrats don't have solutions, and that's why we need an alternative. And then, of course, they're going to call us spoilers, and I think we got to say we got an answer to the spoiler problem. It's proportional ranked choice voting, proportional representation, and that gets rid of the problem of gerrymandering as well as winner take all, lesser evil dynamic. So, if we don't raise those issues, they're not going to be raised, certainly not by the Democrats. Todi Chilnil. Sorry for mispronouncing that. Did you see that ICE is kidnapping indigenous people to try to get tribes to enter into an agreement with them? I know they're grabbing indigenous people, which is, ironic. I mean, if anybody is here, it's indigenous people. I mean, they're not immigrants. The ancestors of people like me are the immigrants. But I didn't hear about what kind of agreement with the tribes that the government is trying to get them to enter into. But it's ridiculous. I know that a lot of Sioux living in Minneapolis are having a hell of a time with ICE. We're just grabbing them because they look Mexican. It's disgusting. It's like I said, these guys are like the Ku Klux Klan. They masked and anonymous, and they're doing violence to people that are just going about their lives. Vicky Corden, people need to call Congress and Senate to stop Trump from going after Greenland. It could lead to a big war. The United States is a villain. Yeah, I'll just underscore the contact your representatives and senators part. They don't hear enough from us, and it does have an impact at the margins. And one way to really push them is to run our own candidates, because then they got to compete for our votes. And our positions are popular. So if we run a decent campaign that can, get out there to the public, the Democrats are going to have to move, or they're going to lose. Anthony Al, Greg Stoker, pro-Palestine TikTok influencer, combat veteran, Freedom Flotilla activist, is running for U.S. House for the Green Party of Texas. Yeah, I didn't know he was a big TikTok influencer. I guess I did. And he's got a slogan that the Greens on the national committee lists are questioning, because he's saying he's just a regular guy, not insane. And people think that's insulting to people that have had mental health issues. It's ableist language. I'm not sure how that's going to play out. The other thing is he's seeking the Green Party nomination. There'll be a Texas convention that will decide that. But he's definitely on the radar of the Greens National Committee. In the last week, his candidacy has been discussed quite a bit. Todi Chini. The agreement would mean that ICE wants to do raids on reservations. Well, any indigenous nation that signs up for that is, slitting its own throat. I don't think you'll find many that do, and if any. And then, what's ICE going to do? Go on anyway? Probably. I mean, it's ICE has got to be stopped. think I said last week, ICE and Border Patrol, which is even worse, need to be abolished, dismantled. And then we need an agency that provides services to immigrants, legal services, social services to help them integrate into society. These immigrants are adding to our society, not subtracting from it. Kevin Rosa, with Trump threatening the Insurrection Act over peaceful protests in Minneapolis being targeted by the DOJ, do you think progressives need to be more militant, or should they continue civil agitation? Well, I think I answered that previously. I think we should be nonviolent. It's more persuasive with the broader public. It wins more people over to our side. It's safer for us because it's harder for even, these goons and ICE and Border Patrol to attack if we're being nonviolent. But that doesn't mean we don't have the right to self-defense when we're being attacked. But yeah, I think now, if by civil you mean uncivil, by uncivil you mean disruptive, like strikes that stop production, sit-ins that get in the way. I think those tactics, if they're not violent, should be considered and used where it seems like it's going to be effective, and that has to be worked out in each community. Anthony Al, DNC Pied Piper strategy. Democrats help boost far-right candidates like Donald Trump with the belief that they're easier to beat. Didn't work with Donald Trump. Yeah, okay. That is stupid. You legitimize the far right. And so, people say, well, they listen to far right lunatics they otherwise wouldn't take seriously. That's what Hillary Clinton did, encouraging the media to promote Donald Trump because she thought he'd be easy to beat. Dumb strategy. And the DNC doesn't really seem to have learned because, they've done that in state elections since then. Vicky Corden, the ban for immigrant visas for 75 countries, it is really about stopping immigration. New immigrants already sign affidavits not to use public assistance. Yeah, and they're not qualified. They unless they become citizens, they can't get access to various forms of public assistance. I may have told this story before on this podcast, but when I was at the farmers market, regional market here in Syracuse, and got a table to petition. This is in 2024 presidential election. That would have been to get Jill Stein on the ballot. This guy came up to me and said, and behind me was a line of people that were going to get vouchers. I don't know if they were actually, food stamps or a state program, but there were coupons people could use to buy produce at the farmer's market. And he said, look at all those immigrants on welfare. And I said, you can't get those vouchers unless you're a citizen or at least a legal resident. And he was surprised. He had a Trump hat on. And he's like, really? I thought, these illegal immigrants were taking everything. I said, no, if they're undocumented, they can't get any of that stuff. But that's the kind of nonsense that, Trump and Vance and those idiots, I'm thinking of them saying those Haitians living in Springfield, Ohio, were eating neighbors' cats and dogs. I mean, it's totally false. And they put it out there. And, the mainstream media, like, they're too objective in the sense that they're like, okay, both sides. They just report it as, he said, she said, rather than saying, Trump said that, but it's ridiculous. That's a fact too. That should be reported. I think, I just get, my skin crawls every time I see the cable news covering, Trump's various antics which he does every day, and they cover him every day. And they think, that gets eyeballs on the screen and it gets some advertising. But at some point, they got to have some journalistic ethics and, debunk this nonsense that he's saying. Kevin Rosa, Howie, do you think a general strike is doable in the U.S. with most Americans living paycheck to paycheck? If so, do you have any thoughts on how we might begin such a large mobilization nationwide? To pull off a general strike would take very, robust, dense organization and a lot of preparation. When we go on strike in unions, we have a strike fund that pays us money while we're not getting our paychecks. There's nothing like that ready, across the U.S. I mean, the private sector, unionization is down to 5.9% at the end of 2024. I think with the public sector, people included, it's like 12%. So most people don't even have a union that could support them. So I think, this general strike in Minneapolis, be worth watching and see what we can learn from it. How many people who are dependent on their paychecks are going to, take a day off? How many people even have the right to take a day off, a paid day off? Not many, because most don't have union contracts that provide for that, a certain number of days of paid leave over the course of a year. If you don't show up, you're not going to get paid for that day. So how many people in Minneapolis are going to give up that day's pay to participate in, the activities of that general strike in Minneapolis? So I think, and then we look back in history of the U.S. I mean, I mentioned the 3 general strikes in 1934. In Toledo, that was an auto factory fight. Minneapolis, that was the Teamsters and truck drivers and warehouse workers. And in San Francisco, Oakland, that was longshoremen. And so those unions or organizing committees in those industries started the strikes, and they spread because the whole community supported them. But that was 3 cities in 1934, had enormous impact. It wasn't a nationwide general strike. The closest we've had to that is the 1877 Great Railway Strike. And railroads were so central to the economy back then, transporting all people and goods. And they went on strike. It was bloody. In the end, I think they didn't get their demands, but it certainly impacted the country. So, yeah, I mean, a general strike is a long way away, one that would be effective. In Europe, they do these general strikes that are not disruptive, but symbolic. So most of the people are organized into unions. And over there, unions don't have exclusive right to each workplace. They have, socialist unions, communist unions, Christian democratic unions, anarchist unions. And when they negotiate with companies, they come together and form a coalition and negotiate. But on the shop floor, these different unions are competing for members. But when they call a general strike, they're organized enough that they can call people out, and they vote to strike, the unions themselves, unlike what we're seeing in Minneapolis. But those are for a day or two, and they're not as disruptive as they could be. So, we shouldn't confuse that with what people, I think, are talking about for a general strike here. AFL-CIO would never call for it, and they don't have enough organized people to make it happen. So I think it's a long way away. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be organizing strike actions over workplace grievances or over general social grievances like they're doing in Minneapolis. I think that kind of action is potentially powerful and something we should, support. But, I'm often called by people who are just internet warriors. We're starting this thing. We're going to start a general strike. And they don't even belong to a union. It just, we got to be realistic and smart. Kevin Sanchez, how do you respond to the accusation that protesters are all paid? That's all I hear from right-wing media. Well, yeah. I mean, the right-wing media, like I said, it's the same as these people that are saying all the protesters in Iran have been organized by, the CIA and Mossad. It's so ridiculous. I think you just respond and say, protesters are not paid. You're a protester, you're not paid. Just tell them they're making that shit up. They don't know that. Pardon my French. Scout 164. Final question. Secular Talk covered that CNN showed a poll that Dems are moving heavily to the left, a major contrast to how they were 50 years ago. Any thoughts? I think they're getting back to where they were 50 years ago, and pretty much were all along. I'm talking about rank and file Democrats. The public, they were New Deal Democrats. It was a semi-social Democratic Party from Roosevelt till the early 70s. And then a crop of post-Watergate Democratic politicians came in that were neoliberals. So they talked about fiscal conservatism and distancing themselves from the unions and, in other words, cutting social programs, winning over business. One senator I knew personally, Paul Tsongas from Massachusetts, and I'd worked with him on the anti-apartheid movement. He'd been in Angola, I think, as a Peace Corps worker, and he was good on that issue. But after by the late 70s, I remember him giving a speech where he said, "Look, the Democrats, we got the women, we got the blacks, we got the environmentalists, we got labor. All we need to do is get business, and then we'll rule everything." Of course, the contradiction between business interests and labor interests was just erased by that perspective. But that's the kind of democratic leadership we've had for the last 50 years. There's an article this week by Meyerson, the guy that writes for the American Prospect. I always forget his first name. But, he points out the polling data that shows the base of the Democratic Party is social democratic. That was my argument for saying we should call for a Green New Deal. And I first made it in 2000. And people said, "Oh, that sounds too democratic." But I thought it was good because most Democrats believed in those New Deal type programs, but they were mistaken that the Democratic Party would ever implement them. So if the Greens put it out that way, we might win them over. So I don't think the Democratic leadership, the Democratic power structure is moving heavily to the left. I think the base is moving to the left. They've always been there on the economic class issues, except for maybe a period in the late 70s, early 80s, the Reagan, late Carter era, where they kind of bought into some of the neoliberal nostrums. But, really since Clinton, the backlash to him by Democrats, people have come back to the, where they stand on those social and economic programs. It's the leadership that doesn't support them. And so, like I said, the base has moved. Oh, I was going to say also that where the Democratic base has moved left is on social issues. They're less racist, less chauvinist, male chauvinist, less anti-gay. In other words, it's a more tolerant Democratic Party base than it was 50 years ago. So there has been progress on the social issues and also at the leadership level. In fact, the leaders will be socially liberal in order to be economically conservative. So they'll emphasize to the progressive base that they're socially liberal and downplay how economically conservative they are. And that's another thing that's gone on over the last 50 years. Scott 164, any thoughts on Ukraine's so far largest drone strikes targeting thermal power plants? They might be in the cold, but they're not, I think they're not going quietly into the night. Yeah, I remember this being discussed a couple months ago. Would the Ukrainians attack civilian power so that the Russians were feeling the same cold that the Ukrainians were? And apparently in the last couple of weeks, Ukraine has decided to do that. And they put millions of Russians into the cold. And without having looked in detail, I think the Russians are having a harder time getting the power and heat back on than the Ukrainians are, who have 4 years of practice, because Russia's been doing this to them for 4 years. Ukraine was taking the high road because attacking civilian infrastructure is a war crime. But they've decided that they have to make the Russian public feel the pain like they are, hoping that it will pressure Putin. And I had to write something yesterday, and I was looking at Russian public opinion on the war. And basically, a majority of Russians now want the war to end immediately. They aren't even saying on any conditions. The Ukrainian side wants the war to end immediately, but they do have conditions. They're not giving up land that Russia doesn't already control. They want security guarantees from the West, which Russia won't agree to. And there was a third central point, it's escaping my mind right now. But anyway, only 27%, and this was a poll done by the Kremlin in secret, and somebody leaked it. So 56% of Russians want the war to end immediately, just stop the war, go home, and 27% want to continue the war. And the other number was 83% are feeling worn down by the war. This is Russians. And, they're not feeling it like the Ukrainians are. So Putin, the enthusiasm, despite all the Russian propaganda and the state media, everyday Russians are not so enthusiastic about this war as they might have been early on when people rallied around the flag. Okay, well, I appreciated all the questions and comments, and we'll see what happens in the next week. I will try to get this union president from Minneapolis on the show next week or soon, so we can get a firsthand take on what is going on with the resistance of the people in Minneapolis to this ICE brutality. In the meantime, contact your representatives about these issues, organize your local parties, and, work collectively. Don't just sit online and be there all by yourself. So have a good week, everybody, and we'll see you next week.